All right, so it looks like our recording is going.
You're muted, Jordan. Jordan, you're muted.
All right, so apparently Teams is going to mute me when my dog barks. That's nice of Teams. All right, so I'm going to throw up the shared brainstorming document that we have been working on. I tried to get it zoomed in this time so everybody will be able to see it. All right, so here is our task for the day. And I know in the email I mentioned a couple other things that we would go back over. I think I'm going to save that because one of the things I was going to talk about at the end of this is that we've gotten a little more time to do these things. So we'll have a little more time to go back over some things. So let's start on murders. I've put up the questions that I asked, but we can start wherever folks would like to start.
I would like to add to the list the consideration of any offense that could result in a life sentence. So I understand that there are non-B or A felonies that can result in a life sentence, but if there is a public indecency, that is a felony that could result in a 3 strikes. I would not want someone who would not have a significant amount of experience to do that. I think it is unfair to do that also. Especially in public indecency, there's also a likely to be a significant mental health component to that. One that may have been papered over in prior hearings to get someone out of jail. And this is where the rubber meets the road. So you're not only litigating a mental health defense, but you're also trying to acknowledge the fact that people may have made strategic decisions previously to doing that. That comes along with attempted sex abuse. Any of the sex crimes that could be 3rd strike or Megan's Law cases, I would ask the committee to consider for murder requiring murder qualifications or including in the murder qualifications. Like, I don't know if we can call it murder qualifications after that, but I would want, my perception is that they should have the same standards, or we should expect the same standards of defense. But it could be like co-counsel murder qualified or something. I don't know, but I just would like the committee to consider those.
I agree with you, Reed. Consistent with the naming conventions, we're going to call this attorney level 4. So we won't have to worry about naming it after the types of cases. We'll just have to define what types of cases fit under that level. So we've talked about murders and J laws. I've got potential life sentence crimes at the top. If there's anybody who thinks those should be not in there.
I think that's a really great point. Is that something that is readily ascertainable, like at arraignment? Because I think that would be the only kind of challenge for adding that is, are those somewhat readily identifiable from the beginning?
That was my question.
Arguably, the state would have. Arguably, the state would have to plead that, but I know that that doesn't happen in every county. So that's something that might have to be reassigned later.
And we do have considerations currently for cases that need to be reassigned. They're not, I don't know that OPDC has official policies on them, but I know generally, like, things that start out as low-level felonies get indicted as high-level felonies, and that just happens sometimes.
Sometimes your assault one becomes a murder victim.
Yeah.
Just happens. Melissa
or your assault 4 becomes a murder, which happened in one of my cases. Or attempted murder.
Also, to your concern, Melissa, the practically speaking, in all of the counties that I've operated in, when a murder came in, right, like when a homicide came in, that was like a special appointment. Like, I don't want to say special appointment, but the court would call over and say, hey, can you take this homicide, right?
Right. It's shopped around kind of from the beginning. Yeah.
Just to make sure. And then whether or not that was to make sure all the different providers had their level or at capacity or had capacity for that. That might have been the reason, but these types of offenses are not shopped around by the courts in the same way. So that is a additional consideration when you're asking, like, is this something that's readily ascertainable?
But I think it makes a lot of sense. I have just remember as a baby misdemeanor attorney, all of a sudden finding myself with a public indecency and the guy was facing life. And I'm like,
Ooh,
this is terrifying. And so on behalf of baby misdemeanor lawyers everywhere, I think that is a really valid thing to bring up.
okay, so we will include those.
Can I ask a question about that?
So-
Does anyone have any rough ideas on how many public indecencies are coming through their office or they're handling a year? Is it a pretty small number? Would you expect to see maybe one or two as an attorney a year or less, more?
I think it's a relatively small amount. I can think of a handful that I've even heard of. And I think I can only think of the one that I happened to catch that qualified as the life as a third strike component. So I don't think that this is going to be a big issue or a significant.
Well, I'd say I don't think we
cases.
get a lot
If-
of public indecencies, and then the ones that we get that are third strike are few. Maybe every other year we'd get one, right? So there's not a lot, at least on the public indecency ground.
If it becomes an issue, I know we get access to some of OJD's data. We could probably find the number of public indecency cases that are charged.
I will say it's been a significantly fewer amount since OHP expanded.
Okay,
It would make a difference to me between having that be 700 tier 3 or tier 4.
Okay.
Would be the number of those cases coming through.
I don't know if we can get OJDs to narrow down the number of third strike public indecencies that come through, but we can certainly ask. Let me make a.
I don't know that there's a way to run a report on OJD's end that can pull that out just from what I did at OJD pulling reports. I don't know that you can do that. But
Aren't they
we can-
required to include the statute on that sentence? On the judgment?
when they enter the case, yeah, you have to enter the statute. So if they entered both the crime statute and then the 719, then yes, but I don't know how consistent people are on that.
Thanks.
How do people feel about other levels of homicide, crim neg hom, the like? Should those be included with murder and J law, or should those be included with the level 3 felonies?
My personal feeling is that, I mean, honestly, when there's a body, there should be significant legal skill involved. And I think that probably some of my colleagues that do Dewey manslaughters relatively frequently would disagree with that. But I just, from the PCR, backward looking perspective, there's just so much that goes into a murder case or a crim neg hom or something like that, that I think kind of having a higher bar for skill and experience is where I would err on that.
Anybody else have thoughts?
if we do have that higher bar, I would say that, and I don't know if we're gonna have co-counsel, different co-counsel standards for that. Like we have murder lead and murder co-counsel. If
Mhm.
there's like a homicide lead and homicide co-counsel, I would not have the same. I think that they both could be lower. They could be like one stage lower. I wouldn't be. That's all I'd add.
So you would be okay if one of the 137-700 attorneys handled the criminal negligent homicide cases? Is that right?
I think so.
Okay. I'm just trying to
Or-
make sure I understand what you're.
Or if they were maybe like murder co-counsel qualified, but hadn't gotten that murder trial under their belt, right? And then so like if they're the lead counsel, then if they have co-counsel, that co-counsel doesn't have to meet the murder co-counsel qualification. They can meet a lower qualification level, like a 700 qualification level.
Right. Are we
Gotcha.
going to have like an attorney 3.5 or an attorney 4 and attorney 5? Because it seems like we need an in between 700 level attorney and full on murder qualified attorney. And I don't know that we've built that in yet. And maybe I'm wrong and we don't need that. But
What if it's like you can start co-counseling level 4 if you've been at level 3 for X amount of time or done X amount of trials or whatever? So it's not like another qualification level, but just a let's not jump right into it type thing.
Well, that takes a down to the second question I have. Do we want the murder co-counsel or a murder co-counsel type of classification, or do we want to say that, if you're attorney level 3, you can co-counsel murders, for example?
I think if you're attorney level 3, you can co-counsel murder. I would agree with that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Anybody
so
want to make the case for the attorney level 3.5 or attorney level 4 co-counsel position?
I think murders are just such different animals than a standard trial kind of case. It's just a different rhythm. It's just they're very different cases in my experience, and so kind of spending some time focusing on them and getting a feel for them, I think has value. But I've done one murder trial, so I'm not the authority on this subject.
So when you say spending time and focusing on them, do you mean like doing it as the only kind of case you're doing, or like training up to doing it as lead counsel?
I think I mean training up to do it as lead counsel and having
Okay.
a number of them under your belt. I think you're right that maybe that is something that if someone chooses to do that as part of their I'm qualified at the 700 level, I'm an attorney 3 and I'm comfortable as an attorney 3 and I'm ready to start thinking about moving up to attorney 4. I think that would be satisfactory.
Does anybody else have a sense that, maybe, I mean, we talk about murder is different, and I shared a sense that like murder cases really do have their own cadence, and murder clients have kind of their own ways. I also think that major felony sex cases have their own cadences and their own ways. And it may be that what we're looking at here are, kind of a 4A and 4B, right? That there are common qualifications, and that also there are qualifications for J-law cases, for soloing J-law cases, or lead counseling J-law cases, and for soloing or for lead counseling murder cases. I wonder what everybody else feels about that.
I would hesitate on making it too complicated.
Sure.
Just like having so many sub levels of qualifications seems like it's harder to implement.
Yeah, if I heard the question correctly, Charlie, you were breaking up at least on my audio, but I think murders and J-law should be co-counsel, and I think the co-counsel should be the junior co-counsel should be level 3 qualified. And I think your question is, what do you do with manslaughter? I think criminal negligent homicide is fine for a level 3. I think manslaughter is your question as to whether you need to be level 4 or level 3 qualified for manslaughter. I would be fine either way. Although if it's a level 3, I think then if it's a manslaughter is okay for level 3, then I think that manslaughter should be co-counseled at level 3. Or I think if you're a tier 4 attorney, you can handle manslaughter on your own. But I think a tier 3 attorney should have to have a co-counsel on a manslaughter.
Jordan, do you have the attorney level 3 qualifications handy that you could either send around or put in a chat or something, just to
Yes.
refresh what we're talking about?
Yeah. So let's see. I will just pop them into the chat, what we've had so far. Oh, okay. It's going to do weird formatting for me, but that's should be readable. It added the comments as footnotes. I don't know why. But that's what we've had so far as our discussion.
So I'm looking at the murder qualification standards that we currently have, and they're pretty simple. Meet the major felony or the section 3 or the standard 4, whatever the previous qualification level number is going to be, has met that for 3 years, has demonstrated, scholarship and good work, has acted as a leader co-counsel in 5 major felonies, tried to a jury. So in our current standards for murder, it does have a 5 major felony jury trial component, which I think is appropriate. And then for co-counsel, it has, and then it says has co-counseled one of these murder cases as a co-counsel. And then to be murder qualified co-counsel, we have has done all of those things, just you don't have to go through trial. So I'm just going through the regular murder qualification standards for us. I don't see major changes in the things that I am asking to have happen. I do agree with Carl that when we're talking about manslaughter, if it is I think tier 3 attorneys can handle that. I think if it is a tier 3 attorney, then we're going to expect that they have a co-counsel on it so that they're not handling all of it. I think if it's a tier 4 murder qualified attorney, then they should be able to handle that manslaughter on their own.
So you're thinking 2 tier 3s or 1 tier 4 attorney?
Yeah. The only consideration I would have is if there's an expectation or we're trying to mitigate against the risk that manslaughter would then become a murder due to some change in the indictment or the information. But I would prefer not to build that expectation into our qualification standards. So if we have a qualification that says manslaughter and crim neg hom can have 2 tier 3 attorneys, that's our line, right? And if some other jerk wants to turn this thing into a murder, then we are now going to have to find a murder qualified attorney for that. I am comfortable with that change. I mean, I recognize that might cause huge amount of delay for a client. And from a client-centered perspective, that might not be the best idea, right? Like, because now we're changing attorneys mid-course. So I fully recognize that that is a really difficult question to have. But I would prefer to not invite or hedge against the idea that a manslaughter or a crime neg ham is going to be turning into a murder. I think we just should treat it what it is at appointment or at assignment.
And
Well,
just a quick response, Reed, you wouldn't be changing attorneys because the 3 would be on it, you'd be adding a 4.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
a 3 could stay as co-counsel for the
Yeah,
murder.
they'd stay as
and-
co-counsel.
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
One of the two.
One of the 2. Yep.
I like that.
Well, they could technically they could both stay on. The third person could be the other 3 could be a third chair, and they just don't get credit, but at least they get the
Mhm.
experience. So, yeah. I also think it's probably pretty rare that a manslaughter goes to murder post indictment, right?
That was my thought. They tend to overcharge and then offer manslaughter to get rid of
Yeah.
it.
Unless your
practice in Marion
client
County.
likes to make lots of statements on
Marion,
the phone while they're
Douglas,
being
all of them.
recorded.
That's true. Their clients often help turn it into a
Yeah.
murder sometimes. With regard to the, what is it, subsection B to B, the J-law versus murder, my only worry, and part of the reason I wanted to look at the level 3 qualifications is that there's no guarantee that you've ever worked on a J-law case before you are qualified as an attorney to take a J-law case. I mean, you could have all of your qualifying stuff be robbery cases and not necessarily have anything to do with sex offenses, and all of a sudden you're qualified to take a J-law single-handedly. And so I either we add in attorney 3 that if you want to take J-law cases, you have to have some qualifying sex case experience in attorney 3, or that some of those felony trials or cases that you're part of, at least one has to be a sex case, or we just have a sub qualification in attorney 4 that says if you want to take J-laws, you have to have underlying qualifications of relevant sex cases. But I think we have to force some experience somewhere to make sure that you're not just flying blind.
I'd agree with that. I think that's really important on both murders and J-laws. You have to have sat there with a jury, I think, before you can really understand what it's like. The weight of a body in the room is just different. And we've already talked about the pacing on a murder case. There's so much to do when they first come in. It's not like other cases. They're just different. In J-law cases, interacting with the jury is completely different. So I think it's important for both of those. When you get up to 3, you've probably got enough trial experience to do it, but you need to ride co-counsel on those things and actually sit through a jury and see what that room's like, if you really want to be confident and ready to do those cases on your own.
I agree. I think I think we did this in a different level, where we talked about the idea that you had to co-counsel from beginning to end 3 cases and co-counsel a trial. I think it should be the same for J-laws and murders. I think you should have to.
Yeah.
I don't know about the 3 number. That might be a little bit more challenging, but I think you have to at least co-counsel one from beginning to end. And obviously, in an ideal world, you'd have at least one trial that you co-counsel.
I think requiring those 2 separate qualifications and saying if you want to be solo qualified on J-law cases, you have co-counseled 3 from start to finish, and at least 1 went to trial. I don't know how realistic that is. I personally haven't taken a J-law case to trial, so I don't know how often those go. Sure seems like sex cases settle more often than they go to trial because nobody wants to see that in a jury.
Does oops, sorry.
And then the same with murders. I would think if you have co-counseled from start to finish 3 murders, you at least have a sense of how they go. And if you've had at least one murder trial, I don't know. I don't necessarily want to reduce the murder qualification we currently have, because I think the people that are doing murders by themselves are sufficiently qualified, and I like that level. And I don't want to hurry people into, these are the cases in particular that you don't want to hurry people that aren't actually qualified and confident in doing it, because the stakes are so high.
I would say I've seen in other cases where they have J-law, like you get qualified for J-law cases or that equivalent, and then you get qualified for murder, and they would make the murder qualifications dependent upon J-law. I really don't think that always seemed to me that it didn't make sense, because they're really important and serious cases, but they're not similar in that regard. I would view those as like separate tracks. So if that was something we were going to ponder, I don't think it makes sense to say that J-law, having done a J-law case doesn't really mean that you're qualified for a murder case. It's just different.
Yeah,
So are we talking about splitting out the qualifications for murder and the qualification for J-law as separate?
I think like a 4A and a 4B, and you can be a 4AB.
I don't.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't
KO
think
is
it's
shaking her
necessary.
head.
I don't think it's necessary personally. I've had, like 8 or 9 murder trials and probably 3 or 4 J-laws. They're both really complicated. But I think if you've done one, you can do the other, because you would have had experience with sex offenses before you could ever get to tier 4. So you would have had experience with sex offenses and sex offense trials, most likely. And then the same thing for homicides. You should have had multiple assaults, and you would have already co-counseled one, right? So I start to worry a little bit about jurisdictions where there's just fewer trials. I'd like to see someone co-counsel at least one J-law start to finish, at least one murder start to finish, and had it co-counseled at least one trial. And whether it's a J-law or murder, ideally you'd have co-counseled each of them a trial, but I don't think we should make it a requirement. I think it should be one or the other. It suffices for both.
I don't like the idea of separating them out, in part because I don't want OPDC to be able to pay us differently for the two of them. And I also, and no offense to KO and Jordan. Also, I don't want the legislature to think about the workload as something different, right? My goal in combining these two, or having these two be the same qualification standard, I'll just share my goal, is that we are expecting each of these attorneys to do a considerable amount of work. That work is going to take time. And those are going to be about the same when the stakes are at that level, right? So if they are one qualification standard, to me, we're signaling, or we're telling the legislature that this is the amount of work that we're expecting attorneys to put in on murders, on J-laws, and on cases in which somebody might be going to prison for the rest of their life without parole. So that's where I would say, let's not have A and B. Like, I just want tier 4 heavy hit. This is where we are.
Well, and the other consideration is in rural areas where there's not very many attorneys, the more you start to divide the qualifications, the more difficult it becomes for us to find attorneys that are qualified. So I just think that putting it together in one qualification, I think makes sense for a lot of reasons. I agree with a lot of with everything Reed said. All of the sentences on all of these crimes are set by the legislature, and one thing that I think the agency is trying to at least signal is the more significant the punishment, the more time it's going to take in terms of attorney hours. And that's a decision that the legislature needs to consider when they're making considerations of how to set punishments. Because that's what the that's what the numbers are showing us, is the more significant the punishment, the more time attorneys take on the cases.
And the more skilled the attorney has to be, which means the more
Right.
investment you have to put into that attorney to get them to that skill level.
It's
Yep.
like you all persuade people for a living. I completely agree with you and have changed my mind.
Shh, don't tell anyone.
I do think it's important though that we require somewhere along the line that someone has had experience on a sex case before they are qualified to take a sex case, because our attorney 3 level doesn't specifically require that. And so either we add that into an attorney 3 level, or we make that a requirement of getting to attorney 4, is that if you're going to be qualified for J-Law cases, it can't just be that you've had so many 137-700 cases with maybe those are, you know, attempted murder and robbery, and you've never actually seen a sex case or dealt with a psychosexual evaluation or anything associated with that. I think there's got to at least be some experience with that required somewhere along the line before you just hand that off to someone.
So where then do you think we should put that? Do we require them to co-counsel a J-Law case, like we're talking about requiring them to co-counsel a murder case? Or do we put that in the, you must have handled X serious felony sex cases? Or
I think putting it in the co-counsel it in the same way that you have with a murder, I think treating it like a murder, kind of bolstering Reed's perspective that these are big cases with and should be treated similarly, and the work is similar. I think just kind of mimicking that requirement makes sense to me. I don't want somebody to, you know, get roped into that. Well, you're qualified. Here you go. Go ahead. And them just having zero idea how to even address that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So then we've got 3 broad categories of things that we've talked about. Time at level 3, having handled major felony trials, which we'll reclassify, for better word to fit our new standards. And then co-counsel at least one J-Law case from start to finish, at least one murder case from start to finish, and either a murder or a J-Law trial.
Based on what Carl was saying, and I don't know if he's still on, but I thought kind of what Carl was saying was that if you were doing one of those cases, oh, I see what you're saying. Are we going to make it so that you have to co-counsel a J-Law and co-counsel a murder, or is it okay to counsel, co-counsel, say you do 2 murders or 2 J-Laws, would that get you there and then actually have to do a trial on one or the other? I mean, do we want to make that distinction where you have to have one of each? And the reason I say that is I know people who have no interest in doing murder cases, but they do J-Law cases. And I know people who are the other way, though it seems less common around here. If a person went in and just wanted to do J-Law cases when they got higher level qualified and just didn't want to do murders, if they went in, do we have to have them co-counsel a murder in order to get up to this level? Or is doing a few J-Law cases sufficient?
I mean, can we just articulate that if you want to be lead counsel on either of these case types, you have to have demonstrated co-counsel on that case type?
I think that becomes difficult to administer if we split it like that. I think what we want,
it's a question that we need to decide if we think that that murder and J-Law are, fungible for the purpose of the standards. If they are, then it's very easy to write this. If they're not, then we have to split it out and require each.
Jordan, couldn't we just, when they're qualified? Yeah, that's right. Never mind. Yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Because I think from our end, we're going to have, like, our accounts payable is going to check this and say, well, they're attorney level 4, so we can pay them at this rate. And I don't think they're going to be real interested in doing sub-level checks, if that makes sense. I mean,
Well,
if
this
that's what
one-
the
I mean,
group ends
we
up
can
recommending,
have-
that's what I will recommend, but
Right, we can have them do it, but it will slow them down. Is the more we ask them to do, the slower they move, and that's not the direction we've been trying to go.
But would it be a sub-level check? Because if I'm hearing Kevin correctly, I don't disagree. So it's, if let's say you weren't interested in murders, I mean, when you got tier 4 qualified, wouldn't that just be an OPDC qualification issue, not a payment issue? Because the payment's the same whether you're doing J law or murder, right? And so wouldn't it just be a OPDC qualification issue that we're qualifying you tier 4 only J law because you only co-counseled a J law and you won't, from beginning to end, you only had a J law trial, or vice versa, or murder.
I think
maybe.
we're maybe,
then does it
but
go
one
that-
of the
Doesn't that go to the two
One of the-
separate paths idea?
Mhm.
right, because one of the concerns that I would have is you would co-counsel, say, I want to do J laws, I don't want to do murders. I co-counsel a J law, I'm level 4. If I then decide that I want to do murders, I don't know that there's a way the agency could say, we know you aren't qualified to do murders because you haven't co-counseled a murder.
Yeah, so when
what I
when
mean?
you do the qualification, why wouldn't it be qualification tier 4 J law, or qualification tier 4 murder, or qualified tier 4 both?
That's what
And
I was
then you
talking
get
about, the 4A,
Right.
4B, or 4AB.
Mhm.
And our one of the concerns about breaking it up like that is the more you break up the qualifications, that means in Eastern Oregon we could have people that all qualify on level 4 and say I only want to do murders. We need to have a J law case and we need somebody out there to do J laws.
Well, one suggestion that I had, or some comments that I had, and I'm in Eastern Oregon, so, but what I had thought was, I think what Melissa was saying about having prior sex trial experience is a good thing. I just don't know that you need to say that you have to have co-counseled a J law case and a murder case to be level 4 qualified. And one of the reasons is I think if you have a significant amount of Measure 11 trial experience at level 3, and some of that is sex trial experience, I think if you can document that, maybe you've had a few trials. I know that I've had some trials that are not J law cases, but they're Measure 11 sex cases, and they're there's multiple counts, possibly multiple victims, alleged victims, and the exposure is just as much as a J law case or more. So I think there can be an avenue to getting qualified with having that experience, but not necessarily requiring a co-counsel on J law case. Those are just some thoughts.
And you're right. I guess I'm using J law as shorthand for you got to have some prior experience with a sex case because it's such a different animal. But you're right. Whether that's a Measure 11 or a 700 sex case or not, or a J law case, I don't think that is a distinction. I think it's just the nature of a sex case in itself. Just because there's pieces that you won't ever face, and we don't have that built into the Attorney 3 requirement at this point. I don't know if that's something. Well, no, I don't think we put that in the Attorney 3, but
I think
maybe
it would
we
be
just
difficult to require substantial experience with sex cases to get to level 3, because I think most of the
Right.
sex cases are at level 3.
at level 3, yeah. And so, I mean, maybe we just put something like or equivalent experience and let somebody that is interested in doing J law work show that they've done, presumably that person is going to have done sex cases at the level 3, at level 3. And so those are going to be the trials that they have to demonstrate. And the people that want to do murders are going to have other cases to show, and they're going to want to co-counsel a murder case. And maybe we just kind of let them establish it for themselves. I mean, this is also not going to be a ton of people we're talking about. This is, I don't know.
I will say my concern with splitting J-Law and murders into letting people choose which they're qualified for is that my experience is exactly the opposite of Kevin's. Nobody I know wants to be J-Law qualified. If I could say I won't take J-Law cases, but I'll take murders and major assaults, I would, and maybe without making any admissions did do that.
Well, people seem to like the Massachusetts qualification. So what if we did what you have down as number 3 right now? So that's one way to get to this level, or the Massachusetts as the other alternative way to get to level 4, tier 4.
I started looking at the Massachusetts thing, but I didn't get to the murder part. Can you just summarize real quick what their system was?
I
Sure,
sent
it's in I copied the minimum requirements that Reed sent last week into the chat, so it should be up above what we have as level 3.
I emailed a PDF a screenshot that should have, I just made a little table with the 2, Massachusetts and Oregon. I think that's what they look like. If I missed it, if I miscopied, let me know.
It's a significant number of trials over a period of years, which accounts for a jurisdiction where maybe you don't have that many J-Laws or murders, so it'd be really hard to meet qualifications under level 3. Because the way 3 reads right now, pretty easy to get qualified in Multnomah, Washington County, and some of the bigger counties, but much more challenging in the other counties. So the Massachusetts way gets someone the opportunity to get there without having necessarily tried a murder or J-Law. I mean, in an ideal world, you're trying one of them, but might not be the best to have one size fits all for the whole state, given the difference in the counties.
The only thing that I think, Carl, you and I are agreeing on a lot of this stuff. The only thing that I worry about when it comes to murder, and I've done a lot of, I've done a bunch of J-Law cases. I've been on, well, actually tried, I think 4 murders, but I've been on probably a dozen. The murder cases are different, and it's just because when they come in, like a lot of the J-Law cases and things like that, the cases have kicked around for a long time. They've been investigated, so they're not coming in hot. And sometimes they are, but a lot of those are like old allegations. When a murder case comes in, a lot of the time the murder just happened, and there's so much stuff that if you don't do it immediately, you lose it. Getting immediate psychological evaluations at the jail, immediately getting an investigator on it. They come in so hot that the first 45 days of those cases is completely different than any other kind of case. And my concern is if you've never actually been on a murder case and actually gone through that process, that it's going to throw you're going to miss an opportunity to do things that can really make a difference for your client.
I agree. I completely agree. And this, I think we could go back a little bit to some discussion we had earlier with the idea of training being built in and being required by the statute. Is this where we add some training component to this as well? Again, I mean, I think in to the system I hope we get to, you'd have to take a 2-day training program before you'd ever be able to touch one of these cases. So yeah, you've met tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Not like, I'm not saying 2 weeks, I'm just saying at least a 2-day intensive training program on how to represent someone charged with murder or how to represent someone charged with J-Law. It takes you kind of beginning to end as well. I mean, then you're having uniformity across the state and across providers to make certain that people have the same basic level of foundational training before they're handling them.
Right, because until you've handled a murder, I mean, you might have gotten it with a crim neg com or a manslaughter earlier on, but you haven't done any worked with a pathologist before, in all likelihood, or had to go through a coroner's report and figure out where there might be some issues, an issue spot based on that. So,
Or even like a motion to preserve evidence, or like save the body, or
Right.
like seal off crime
Mhm.
scenes, and like getting those
So-
like immediately. Having a training on this would be, if we want to incorporate training into the standard, that's fantastic. That's a great idea.
Right.
Yeah.
And I personally am in support of training.
Yes.
The thing, I'm not like thrilled by the Massachusetts. I just have it because it's like a simple thing and one of the things that we have available to us to compare. I do like their disclaimer that if you meet, we're setting minimum requirements, but you also have to apply for it. So in combination with the training and I think an application process for murder might be useful, right? I mean,
Mhm.
for offices like ours, if we have like a high volume of that, then it may be tedious administrative work, but if we want to set these standards for representation, I think that's work that has to be done. We should be compensated for that in a way. We can figure out how. I do recognize that with respect to an application process, that the agency has had some allegations of bias lately. So I want to, like, while I do think that having an application process is important, there has to be sufficient guidelines in order to prevent that. And obviously, words on a policy will suffice. But I just want to flag that for everyone as well.
I think as long as the application is, I mean, we've got like, you need to hit this widget, this widget, this widget. As long as we all agree that all of those widgets are sufficient, and then somebody meets all of those widgets, the application should be granted. I think the Massachusetts one has that disclaimer because, like, it's kind of a squishy thing, whereas ours is a lot more concrete.
I have to go to call,
And
but I
our-
approve of this message.
Thanks,
Thank
Reed.
you. It's nice to see everyone.
And our current qualification standards have something similar to, just because you meet the minimum qualifications doesn't mean that you'll be approved to do this level of work.
Yeah.
And I expect that'll stick around. I suppose I should also say that since it's been brought up, neither KO or I have any real control over what the attorney rates are or what gets paid. So just, to be upfront about what KO and I have control over.
Nothing.
All right, so we've got, call it 3 major categories and 2 ways to meet one. So we are going to have we're going to have some amount of time at level 3 that we need to talk about. A number of trials that someone has done, either co-counseling a case or the Massachusetts model, which is, I think, a higher number of trials that someone has done.
Yeah.
And some training component if available. How do we feel about that? Anything else in terms of broad categories that people should add? Do we want to keep the reference check that we currently have? We can demonstrate to 3 people, blah, blah, blah.
I never think that's a bad idea, just because it gives a little more context for how this person functions, or if there's any sort of abnormalities, a local practitioner or a local judge weighing in can be useful, I think.
Seems to me people just ask their friends.
But
Well,
even
also
so, I
doesn't-
don't think that's a
Yes,
bad-
but I also. Sorry,
Does
Kevin, go
that-
ahead.
we say that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if their friends have qualified, that
Right.
way you at least know they have somebody they can call up going, oh my God.
They've got a network.
They have
Exactly.
at least one friend.
They haven't alienated everyone.
Well, I mean, it seems to me earlier there was this group put in the requirement to show that you have a network of persons that you could. It seems to me that would be more appropriate than just a letter from a judge that says, Yeah, they've been in my courtroom, and I think they're a good attorney. I don't see a value in that. I see more value in having a peer saying that they think you're a good attorney than a judge saying that they think you're a good attorney.
I agree with that 100%.
You know,
I think it's
and
harder
I would.
to convince a judge than my friend group, but that's
Well,
probably
I also
situational.
I'd also be concerned that this would start sliding into that subjectivity thing that Reed was talking about, and also like there are some judges who maybe don't like you because you're being a really strong advocate, and they feel like you're getting in the way of, you know, air quotes, justice when you're actually doing a really good job.
That's actually a good point and one I wasn't thinking about. One of the reasons that they don't allow, or that they wanted to get the public defense out of the judicial branch is because of the fear of judges appointing defenders and how that's been manipulated in other jurisdictions. So giving the judges a say or demanding that the judges, you have a judge letter, could control the judges pushing back at people who fight too hard in their courtrooms. So that's probably not a great idea.
That's a good point. I mean, I think either or, you know, if somebody has a judge that has kind of taken them under their wing, that could be useful. But if they've also got three of their peers that have been mentoring them over the course of this process, that could be useful too. I think letting people kind of whatever is situational, or if their former mentor has since become a judge, that can also be a very useful circumstance, and it would kind of be rough for people who have a lot of turnover in the bench where they are, and now all of their former friends are judges, and we've precluded them from using them as you know, that would be
Now you have to make new friends.
Yeah, I think,
no way.
yeah,
That's
I
not
think
what we do.
if the judge wants to give it to you, I think that's good. Requiring it, I think, would give him veto power, which we don't want. The other thing I'd say is the people that are saying that you have the skills should be qualified at that level. So
Yeah.
Your level 2 friends shouldn't be saying you're ready for level 4.
Right.
I would be particularly interested in getting information about where people are qualifying, you know, because they have co-counseled on cases. I would be very curious to hear reviews from the people that co-counseled. You know, just to confirm that they actually were there and they actually did, you know, 40% of the work.
So your audio is breaking up real bad. I don't know if anybody else is having that.
I'm sorry.
Was able to keep up at first, and then near the end, I just lost you.
I'll just drop it in the chat. I'm not sure what's going on.
You're saying that you want a letter from whoever they co-counsel the case to meet the other requirement. Okay.
Agreed.
Yeah. So let's jump back to the top and talk about time. How long should someone be taking the kind of level 3 mandatory minimums cases before they start looking at lead counseling, murder, and J-law cases? Currently, we're talking 3 years.
I was thinking 2 or 3.
Well, if we're requiring co-counseling of a J-law and perhaps a murder, with one of them to trial, those cases often will take 2 years to get to trial.
I'm good with 3 years.
We're 1 year in misdemeanors right now, and then how long in felonies in tier 2 before you get to tier 3? I'm sorry, I can't remember. Is it 1 year, 18 months?
It is
18 months.
one year in misdemeanors to get to level 2. If you're full-time practice, or at least half-time practice in public defense or criminal defense, and 18 months if you're less than half-time in criminal defense. And then from level 2 to level 3, I think we said 18 months. So you're talking at minimum 2.5 years.
2.5 years. So yeah, I think 3 years.
I
don't know.
I would say 18 months or 2 years. I would come down a little. Just because if you're full time, you put 4 years in and you've done a lot of work.
You
I'm gonna
think
agree
full
with
time
Bob
you're
on
ready
that.
to solo a murder case?
Honestly, yes. I mean, I've seen some attorneys
Okay.
that are 4 or 5 years in that are a lot. Yeah, they're fantastic. I would have no qualms about them doing it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think and if you stretch out, if you do 3 years, then you're looking at 5.5 years. That's a really long time. If you've done these other things to get qualified and you're in 4.5 years, I think
Mhm.
that's
You're a hustler. Yeah.
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 Because again,
think
like you've got
I think I have said before, I find time a particularly poor measure of skill, so I don't.
Yeah, and if you're getting your shot to do these co-counsels and all that stuff, the other things that are necessary, the lower echelon of the groups don't get those shots as quickly. So to get moved up, you got to be a pretty bright bulb to start with. So.
No, my only hesitation is really just in those first few years as a lawyer, there's so much transition in your life. Like you're figuring out how to be an adult outside of law school and do all this stuff and just getting your feet under you as a lawyer and about 4 to 5 years in for these hustler people that's the time when we experience the most burnout in my experience. And so kind of making sure that people are not just racing to the finish and losing their mind when they've got a docket full of murder cases. That's really my only, I think, gut reaction hesitation is just that's the work-life balance phase where people, that's where the rubber meets the road on when you've got these big major cases. That's where the burnout is the highest, and when you're still working off of new lawyer adrenaline, I feel like there's a little bit of a concern there, but that's also, I don't know that that's something we need to legislate. I think that's something that people can figure out for themselves. It's just something
On
I
the
see a
flip
lot.
And
side,
it's something we can hopefully account for in other places like, work standards or workload standards. And
Hopefully.
I would just say real quick on the flip side of that though is this, in my opinion, not just myself, but for others I've worked with, the highest level of stress, your stress level is consistent with how many clients you have. And so when you're moving up, okay, yes, the stakes are getting higher, but your number of clients is decreasing. So when you're handling, 10 clients at a time, I don't know, I'm a lot stressed out when I have fewer clients than when I had caseloads of 70 and 80. That I found
That's a
much
good
more
point.
stressful. And I think a lot of people feel that way.
Yeah, good
Which is
point.
partly why I think 4 to 5 years, because you also don't want someone to have to wait too long to handle this big level case where they leave because they don't want to wait.
Yeah.
When they're ready. I mean, of course, it's all about being ready, but I'm saying I think it's just something to consider.
I think the when you're ready is important too, because we're setting minimum standards, but there's nothing that says that, someone who has met these standards but doesn't feel ready to do these cases has to apply for certification.
And that also backs up the idea of an application, so that, we get like a writing sample that you actually wrote or something in a former case, and you can start seeing if people perhaps aren't showing that they really are ready.
As the resident baby attorney, I have to agree with what Carl said about the number of clients you have being one of the most stressful parts of it, and but moving up when you're ready to. But that I think that when you get to the higher levels, having fewer clients really does reduce the work, not the workload, but the stress. One of the big stressors of the job.
Well, it's easier
that
to
is a
keep
good point.
keep in touch with fewer people than it is. Just that part of trying to call everybody.
I think we've talked before about having people submit motions that they've written. Do we want to go back to that? Somebody brought up the application process.
The problem is it's such a huge mess from an HR standpoint, and I don't want to pick on the agency, but we've had some problems with bias and things like that in the past. Now we're going to have, a fairly arbitrary review of what people have written and a determination of whether or not that it is, good enough. It'd be nice if you could come up with a clean system, but just from an HR standpoint, I think it's going to be virtually impossible.
Didn't we move to
Yeah.
demonstrated use of experts, investigation, omnibus
Mhm.
hearings, and then we had the other category, demonstrated proficiency with mitigation? I mean, I know I get it. It's not going to be that easy to administer, but I do think that's important because it sends the message about because the mitigation is essential to tier 4 cases.
Yep. And we've got that as a requirement to move to tier 3.
Yeah.
And I agree. And I think that's the kind of thing that we can put in without having to grade somebody's papers. When you say you've done this, you've done the hearings, and I think that's something that's functional within the kind of system we're setting up here.
Okay. So as far as broad categories or specificity goes, is there anything that anybody wants to add into what we've got here? My next step is going to be take this, move it into our draft and send that out. So is there anything else anybody wants to see in that draft?
Do we want to do anything relating to enhancements or sentencing phase versus guilt phase at any prior levels? Is that, I genuinely don't know. Just, is that something that is so distinct that it needs to be mentioned somewhere along the line?
Not sure I follow the question.
I don't know that it
Like-
needs to be.
Are you asking if we want to require someone to have done sentencing?
No, like in a
Like Blakely
bifurcated
factors?
circumstance. Yeah. Are there arguments about Blakely factors?
Oh.
Is guilt phase versus punishment phase distinct enough that it needs to be something someone has experience with before they let them on their own? I honestly don't know. I think I've argued it once. But I just want to throw it out there and make sure, because I'm clearly not the most knowledgeable on this stuff.
I don't know that there needs to be a separate thing for it. I think that's something that as you get up into level 3 that you'll have exposure to, because you'll start seeing them maybe on repo cases in level 2, and then you'll start seeing them more as you get into like more major felonies. So I think you'll just naturally get exposure to them. Actually, I had a minor felony attorney come to me a couple weeks ago and be like, I have a presumptive probation case and they filed Blakely factors. And I'm like, that's the first time I've seen that. That's very creative. But, I think it's something that you'll slowly get exposure to just
By
over the
virtue
course
of
of
the
doing the
practice.
work. Yeah.
Okay.
And I would hopefully, when you're dealing with those penalty phase type things, that's going to be part of the 2-day intensive training to get people ready for that, because the hearings are kind of what they are. Yeah, I mean, I've seen that with capital murder cases where you'd have a different, you having to actually go through a penalty phase to get capital qualified, but I think that's a different ballgame. So.
Okay. So if anybody comes up with anything else in the next day or two that they think desperately needs to be in here, email me and let me know. My goal is to have a comprehensive draft of everything we've talked about so far, attorney 1, 2, 3, and 4, out to you guys by the end of the day tomorrow. We've got another meeting Monday to talk about kind of the bigger picture process questions, equivalent experience, what the, training and supervision stage looks like. And maybe cover some of the, if there's any kind of lingering questions on the, what we'll call the ready draft. We can talk about that Monday. We've been told this morning that instead of presenting these at the January commission meeting, they're going to get presented at the February commission meeting, which gives us a bit more time to polish things up and review our work product in a bigger picture form. So we've got our meeting Monday. I don't want to schedule anything else this year. I don't know about you guys, but I'm kind of meetinged out for the year. So my suggestion to the group will be on Monday that we take what we've got. I will polish it up. Our manager, Shannon Flowers, is going to take a look at it and go through and do some kind of editing work on all 4 of the subject areas. And so we'll be able to take a look at our area in combination with the dependency, delinquency, and the quasi-criminal areas and see how they all fit together. Maybe have 1 or 2 more meetings in January where we talk about finishing touches on things and see where we get. And then we'll have it ready for submission. Any last lingering thoughts before we finish this 15 minutes earlier than we scheduled it to? Well, I'm going to cut the recording off then and